a sound or you'll wake them in the deepest part of the ancient forest. The flickering candlelight illuminates the faded pages of a story. Hedgehog still sits and tells the stories that people dare not tell before.
The kingdom of the forgotten self. In a land cupped by mist-shrouded mountains, there lay the serene yet sorrowful kingdom of Lethys. It was a place of impeccable order and profound silence, ruled by the benevolent but weary King Theron and Queen Isolde. Theirs was a grief known to every soul in the realm. The Princess Lyra, their only child, was empty. It had not always been so. As a babe, Lyra had been a creature of radiant chaos. Her laughter could make the castle roses bloom out of season, her tantrums would summon sudden, brief thunderstorms. She was a child of pure, untamed essence. But on her 7th birthday, a creeping malaise, known only as the grey silence, stole over her. It was no witch's curse or poison, but a slow, internal extinguishing. The vibrant child faded, leaving behind a beautiful, placid shell. She ate, slept, and walked when guided, but her eyes were twin pools of still water, reflecting nothing. She had no preferences, no memories, no voice. She had, quite simply, forgotten herself. The royal physicians and wandering mages spoke of a soul that had fractured and could not be mended. The queen, her heart a constant, aching wound, would spend her days reading to the silent girl, brushing her long, lusterless hair, whispering, "Remember, my darling. Remember the sound of your own name." Chapter 1, The Echo in the Hall. 10 years passed. The grey silence did not lift. It deepened, settling over the castle and the kingdom like a permanent frost. King Theron's hair turned from gold to silver, his laughter a forgotten artifact. Queen Isolde's beauty became a delicate, brittle thing, like porcelain veined with the fine cracks of her sorrow. They ruled with a heavy gentleness, for how could one demand joy from a people who shared the royal despair? Lyra, now 17, was a portrait of perfect stillness. She sat by the window in her solar, a room filled with the relics of a child who no longer existed, music boxes that never played, dolls with painted smiles gathering dust, books of fairy tales whose endings were lost to her. Her own face was a masterpiece of symmetry, but it was a painting, not a person. Her maids dressed her in silks the color of twilight, and she offered no more resistance than a mannequin. The kingdom's hope had long since curdled into a quiet, communal shame. They had failed their princess. The story of the vibrant child was told less as a memory and more as a cautionary fable about the fragility of the self. It was on the eve of the winter solstice, when the world was at its darkest and thinnest, that the stranger arrived. He came without fanfare, his boots making no sound on the cobblestones of the outer bailey. He was tall and gaunt, wrapped in a traveling cloak that seemed to drink the light from the torches. His name, he told the guards, was Kaelen, and he was a mender of broken things. He was brought before the king and queen in the great hall. The fire roared in the hearth, but it cast no warmth where Kaelen stood. "We have had many menders," King Theron said, his voice weary with the weight of a decade of disappointment. "They have tried spells of binding, elixirs of remembrance, songs of awakening. Nothing remains." Kaelen's eyes were the color of a winter storm, and they held the king's gaze without blinking. "Your Majesty, I do not deal in spells or potions. I am a cartographer of the interior. I map the landscapes of the soul. The malady that afflicts your daughter is not of the body, but of the spirit. She has not lost her memories, she has become lost within them. Her consciousness has retreated into a fortress of her own making, and the drawbridge has been raised." Queen Isolde leaned forward, a flicker of desperate light in her eyes. Can you find her?" "I can journey inward," Kaelen replied, his voice a low, resonant hum. "But the path is perilous, for both her and myself. I will need an anchor, a tether to the world she left behind. Something that held immense meaning to her before the silence fell." Without hesitation, the queen unclasped a locket from her neck. It was a simple, silver thing. Inside was a tiny, perfect painting of a 7-year-old Lyra, her face alight with a mischievous grin, a single, defiant curl escaping her ribbon. She gave this to me on the morning of her 7th birthday. She said it was so I would always have her smile, even when she was cross with me. Isolde's voice broke. It was the last thing she ever said of her own volition. Kaelen took the locket. It felt warm in his unnaturally cool hand. This will serve. The journey will take 3 days and 3 nights. I must not be disturbed. If the tether breaks, or if I am pulled too deep, we may both be lost forever in the labyrinth of her mind. Chapter 2. The Descent into Memory. The ritual chamber was prepared in the highest tower, a circular room with a single window open to the starless night. Lyra was laid upon a bed of soft furs, her breathing even and shallow. Kaelen sat beside her, the silver locket clasped in his hand. He began to chant, not in any language of men, but in a tongue of low, resonant syllables that seemed to vibrate the very air. The shadows in the room deepened, stretching and contorting until they were no longer absences of light, but tangible things. He closed his eyes, and his consciousness unraveled from his body like a silken thread, pulled through the keyhole of Lyra's stillness, guided by the faint, golden pulse of the memory within the locket. He did not arrive in a mind as one might imagine it. He fell into a world. It was a world in ruin. Kaelen stood on a vast, grey plain under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The ground was cracked and dusty, and a cold wind whispered secrets in a language of loss. In the distance, the skeletal remains of a colossal castle clawed at the sky. This was the kingdom of Lyra's self, and it was a wasteland. He began to walk. The air was thick with the ghosts of emotions. Here, a patch of ground shimmered with the faint, warm echo of a childhood joy, a birthday party. There, a twisted, thorny bush seemed to weep with the salt of a long-ago shame, a broken vase, a harsh word from a nursemaid. The landscape was a literal map of her psyche, and it was desolate. As he ventured deeper, he encountered the echoes. They were not memories themselves, but the emotional residue left behind. A shimmering, laughing phantom that was the feeling of playing hide and seek darted past him and dissolved. A heavy, grey fog of boredom from a long afternoon lesson settled around his ankles, trying to slow his progress. He followed the pull of the locket, a faint, golden thread in the pervasive grey. It led him to a forest, but the trees were made of solidified fear, their branches like gnarled, grasping hands. The whispers here were louder, more insistent. You're not good enough. Sit still, be quiet, be a proper princess. What a peculiar, wild child. These were the stones that had built the fortress of her isolation. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a tree of fear. It was a child, perhaps 9 years old, with Lyra's face but full of a sharp, anxious intelligence. This was not Lyra, but a shard, a fragmented piece of her personality given form. You shouldn't be here, the shard said, her voice a nervous twitter. She doesn't want visitors. It's safer inside. Safer from what? Kaelen asked, his voice calm. From the shard whispered, her eyes wide with dread. The weavers. They came when the world got too loud. They promised peace. Before Kaelen could ask more, the ground trembled. The shard gasped and fled back into the forest. From the grey sky descended things that were not quite spiders, not quite shadows. They were the weavers. Their long, slender limbs moved with a hypnotic, clicking rhythm, and where they stepped, the chaotic, colorful echoes of memory were smoothed over, silenced, and woven into the monotonous grey tapestry of the landscape. They were the architects of the grey silence. One of them turned its featureless face towards Kaelen. It had no eyes, but he felt its attention like a physical coldness. It skittered towards him, a limb lashing out, not to strike, but to unmake. Kaelen felt a terrifying pull, a sensation of his own memories, his name, his purpose, beginning to loosen and fray. He focused on the locket in his hand, pouring his will into the memory of Lyra's smile. A pulse of warm, golden light erupted from him, and the weaver recoiled with a sound like tearing silk. It could not tolerate the pure, untamed emotion. It retreated, but Kaelen knew the encounter was a warning. The weavers were the guardians of this emptiness, and they saw him as a disease. Chapter 3, The Fortress of Solitude. The golden thread led him out of the forest of fear and towards the skeletal castle. As he drew nearer, he saw that it was not made of stone, but of interlocking, petrified memories. A wall was built from the repeated lesson of etiquette, a tower from the stifled sob of a repressed tantrum. The drawbridge was not wood, but a solid slab of the word, no, uttered by 1,000 different voices throughout her childhood. The gate was guarded by another shard. This one was older, perhaps 15, with Lyra's features but hardened, her eyes cold and her mouth a thin, disapproving line. She held a spear that was carved from the memory of her first heartbreak, a pet songbird that had flown away and never returned. "Halt," the guardian shard commanded. "This is a place of order. There is no place for your chaotic presence here. You bring the storms with you." "I bring a memory," Kaelen said, showing her the locket. "A memory of a time before the silence." The guardian flinched. "That memory is a lie. It was that vibrancy that attracted the attention of the world. It was that feeling that made the pain so sharp. Here, in the fortress, there is no pain. There is nothing, and nothing is better than agony." "Is it?" Kaelen asked softly. "You remember the pain of the lost bird. But do you also remember the joy of its song? You have built a fortress to keep out the sorrow, but in doing so, you have barred the door against all joy. You are not protecting her, you are entombing her." The guardian shard's resolve wavered. The spear in her hand trembled. "The weavers, they said it was the only way." "The weavers are parasites," Kaelen stated, his voice cutting through the dead air. "They feed on the silence. They do not want her whole, they want her empty, for an empty vessel is easily controlled, and forever their home." He took a step forward, not with aggression, but with pity. "Let me pass. Let me remind her what it is to be alive." With a cry that was part anguish, part relief, the guardian shard shattered like glass. The spear clattered to the ground and turned to dust. The great gate, built of no, groaned and slowly began to swing inward. Kaelen entered the heart of the fortress. It was not a throne room, but a single, vast, circular chamber. And in the center, seated on a chair of pure, clear ice, was Lyra. This was not the shell in the tower, nor was it a shard. This was the core of her consciousness, the princess of the forgotten self. She was ageless and timeless, her beauty absolute and utterly lifeless. Her eyes were closed. From her, fine, silvery threads extended outwards, connecting her to the weavers who crouched at the edges of the chamber, their limbs moving constantly, spinning the threads of her apathy, weaving the grey silence that sustained her prison. She was both the prisoner and the queen of this empty kingdom. Chapter 4, The Unweaving. Kaelen approached the throne. The weavers stirred, their clicking growing frantic, but they did not attack. They were focused on their task, maintaining the delicate stasis. "Princess Lyra," Kaelen said, his voice echoing in the vast, silent chamber. The figure on the throne did not stir. He held up the locket. "I have come from your mother. She remembers you. She begs you to remember yourself." He opened the locket. The tiny, painted smile did not glow or radiate magic. It simply was. And in this place of profound nothingness, its simple, human joy was the most powerful, disruptive force imaginable. A tremor ran through the chamber. One of the silvery threads connecting Lyra to a weaver snapped with a sound like a ringing crystal. Lyra's eyelids fluttered. A memory, raw and vivid, exploded into the grey space around them. It was the memory of the birthday. The scent of sugar and frosting. The feeling of the sun on her skin. The uncontrollable giggle that bubbled up from her chest as her father pretended to be a troll under the table. The memory was a burst of violent, beautiful color in the monochrome world. The weavers shrieked, a sound of tearing fabric and breaking glass. They recoiled from the memory as if it were acid. Another thread snapped. Another memory surged forth, the tantrum that summoned a thunderstorm. The fierce, hot tears of frustration. The raw, untamed power of her own anger as the rain lashed against the castle windows. It was not a pleasant memory, but it was alive. It was passion. "Remember the sound of your own name," Kaelen whispered, repeating Queen Isolde's plea. Lyra's lips parted. A sound, hoarse and unused, escaped. It was not a word, but a note of pure confusion. The weavers attacked. They surged towards Kaelen, no longer trying to unmake him, but to destroy him. Their limbs were like scythes, cutting through the air. Kaelen stood his ground, the locket held high like a shield. Each time a weaver came near the pulse of genuine emotion from the memory, it was thrown back, its form flickering and destabilizing. But there were too many. They began to weave a cage of silencing threads around him, trying to cut him off from the locket, from his purpose. The golden light began to dim. "Lyra," Kaelen shouted, his voice straining. "They promised you peace, but this is death. Your mother's heart is breaking. Your father's laughter is dead. Your kingdom mourns the girl who could make roses bloom. Fight them." On the throne, a single tear traced a path down Lyra's marble cheek. It was the first thing she had felt in 10 years. The tear hit the ice of her throne, and where it landed, a tiny, perfect red rose bloomed. She opened her eyes. They were no longer still water. They were the sky before a hurricane. A roar, not of a princess, but of a primal force long suppressed, tore from her throat. She stood from her throne, and the ice shattered. The silvery threads connecting her to the weavers snapped all at once. The grey silence was broken. The weavers wreathed, dissolving into puffs of meaningless shadow without their source of power. The fortress around them began to crumble, the petrified memories turning to dust. The wasteland of her mind was being scoured clean by a psychic storm of her own making. Lyra looked at Kaelen, and for the first time, there was a person behind those eyes. It was a person full of a decade of trapped pain, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying awareness. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a rusted hinge. "A guide," he said, offering his hand. "It is time to go home. The journey back will be harder than the journey in." Chapter 5, The Cost of Remembering. The world of her mind was collapsing. The grey plain was splitting open, and from the fissures, the raw, unfiltered memories of her life were erupting like geysers, the good, the bad, the beautiful, the terrible. They were no longer neat echoes, but a tsunami of experience. Kaelen held tightly to Lyra's hand, the locket his compass. They ran through the disintegrating landscape, leaping over chasms of forgotten nightmares, dodging falling towers of childhood dogma. Lyra was weeping and laughing, screaming in rage and sighing with wonder, experiencing 10 years of suppressed emotion in a single, terrifying moment. It was agony. It was ecstasy. It was life. They reached the point where Kaelen had entered, the gateway back to the physical world. But it was shrinking, a pinprick of light in the roaring chaos. "We have to jump," he yelled over the tumult. Lyra looked back at the crumbling world of herself. It was a hellscape, but it was hers. Leaving it meant facing the real world, a world she had left as a child and would now re-enter as a stranger. The fear in her eyes was palpable. "I can't," she whispered. "You must," Kaelen said, his gaze unwavering. "To be whole is to feel everything. Even the fear." He pulled her, and they leaped through the vanishing gateway. In the tower room, Kaelen's body gasped, his eyes flying open. He was drenched in a cold sweat, his hands trembling. Beside him, Lyra convulsed. A sound ripped from her throat, a raw, ragged scream that was the first truly her own sound in a decade. Then, it turned into racking, helpless sobs. The queen, who had been keeping vigil at the door, burst into the room. She rushed to her daughter's side, her face a mask of terror and hope. "Lyra, my darling." The princess turned her head. Her eyes, once empty, were now a maelstrom of confusion, pain, and a flicker of recognition. She saw her mother's aged, tear-streaked face and flinched, overwhelmed by the love and sorrow she saw there. It hurts, Lyra choked out, clutching her chest. Everything hurts. Queen Isolde gathered her daughter into her arms, weeping freely. I know, my love. I know, but it is a good hurt. It means you are alive. King Theron arrived, and the sight of his daughter, truly seeing him for the first time in 10 years, brought the king to his knees. Kaelen watched the scene, his expression unreadable. He had succeeded. He had mended the broken thing. But as he looked at Lyra, who was now trembling, vulnerable, and drowning in a decade of delayed feeling, he wondered if some breaks are not cleaner. The silent, placid shell had been a prison, but it had also been a protection. The princess was saved, but the woman who was saved was fractured in a new way, burdened with all she had missed and all she had been forced to feel at once. Epilogue, the Kingdom of the Remembered Pain. The grey silence was broken. Colour returned to Lethys. The castle roses, responding to a shift in a magic they had long missed, bloomed in a riot of crimson and gold. The sun seemed brighter, the air sharper. But the kingdom was not suddenly happy. Princess Lyra was not the joyful child returned. She was a volatile, emotionally raw young woman. One moment she would be seized with a giddy, childish joy at the taste of a strawberry, the next she would be plunged into a bottomless despair over the loss of her childhood, the years she could not get back. Her tantrums no longer summoned thunderstorms, but her grief could make the candles in the hall gutter and die. Her laughter could still make flowers bloom, but her anger could wilt them just as quickly. She was whole, but her wholeness was a storm. Kaelen left without reward, declining the king's gold. Before he departed, he spoke one last time with Lyra. She stood on the balcony, watching the world, her knuckles white as she gripped the stone. You gave me back myself, she said, her voice still unsteady. But I do not know if I thank you or curse you for it. That is the nature of being whole, your highness, Kaelen replied. It is not a state of bliss, but a capacity to contain all things. The joy is real, the pain is real, the silence was a lie. He turned and walked away, his dark cloak blending into the shadows of the courtyard. Lyra remained on the balcony, the wind tugging at her hair. She felt the cold stone, the warmth of the sun, the ache in her heart, and the fragile hope in her soul. She was alive, she was remembering, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled and exhilarated her, that the task of rebuilding her kingdom had only just begun. Not the stone and mortar one below her, but the vast, wild, and terrifyingly beautiful kingdom within. The forgotten self was no more. In its place stood the remembered pain, and from that bitter soil, perhaps, a truer, stronger self could finally grow.
If you feel a chill down your spine, don't worry. They're just standing behind you, listening with you. Thank you for daring to enter the world of fairy tales of Nim. We'll see you again next night, if you're still around.